Hi everyone, welcome to today's non-resident tax webinar in association with Columbia University. My name is Neil from Sprintax and I'm also joined by my colleague Elvira.
Hi everybody, thanks very much for coming along.
Great, so I'll hand the session now over to Elvira, who will go through the initial part, and then Elvira will hand it over to me so we can go through the Sprintax section of the webinar.
Before we get into the real information, just firstly wanted to cover some housekeeping. So you'll notice that the webinar is muted to attendees, and that's simply just to manage background noise. But of course, we always welcome any feedback or any questions that you may have along the way. So please do use the chat box or the question box, and you can submit your questions there, and we will have time for questions at the end. Also, just to be aware that the session is being recorded and will be made available to attendees later. So don't worry too much about taking notes or anything like that today. You will have access to the recording later. You'll receive an email from us in a few hours with a link to today's recording. But in terms of a disclaimer, because it's tax we're talking about, we always start with a disclaimer. So I suppose the aim of the presentation today is to provide you with a general understanding of the tax principles as they apply to international students and scholars, and as such, it's for informational purposes only. Each individual has a unique tax position and is responsible for their own tax determination and compliance. So I suppose basically what we're saying there is that we can't give you individual tax advice on a session like this, because we'd need to ask you other questions about your circumstances and so on. That is the job of the software itself, but we will certainly give you a good understanding of the tax principles as they apply to you today. So in terms of an overview of what we'll cover in today's session, we'll have a look at an overview of tax for non-resident students and scholars. So we'll look at things like, am I resident or non-resident for tax? Who needs to file? We'll look at the different income documents that you might receive. We'll look at things like FICA and ITIN, things you need to be aware of coming into tax season. We'll also look at the implications of filing an incorrect tax return, or maybe not filing at all, and what that looks like and how you can correct that. Then we'll provide an overview of the Sprintax software itself. So we'll show you what that looks like when you sit down to prepare your taxes, so that you're familiar with that process and you're comfortable with it come filing season. So, and lastly, then we'll have time for questions and discussion at the end. So like I said, if you do have any questions, please feel free to pop them in the question box. Now I will say a lot of your questions will be answered throughout the session, but if there's anything that we don't cover or anything that you need a little more information on, please do submit your questions and we'll get to as many of those as we can at the end. So firstly, we're looking at important dates for 2024. And just to be aware that the tax year runs the same as the calendar year. So we're looking at any income that you've earned and any days that you've spent in the US between January 1st and December 31st, 2024. So the same as the calendar year. But another really important date to be aware of is the tax filing deadline. And that date this year is Tuesday, April 15th, 2025. So that is the IRS cutoff date for submitting your tax returns. So it is really important that you do submit your returns by that date to avoid any late fees or penalties or interest accruing on that. So Tuesday, April 15th is the tax filing deadline this year. So I suppose one of the first things we'll always look at when we're looking at non-resident taxes is residency and what determines residency for tax purposes. So firstly, it's important to mention that residency for tax purposes is independent of your visa or immigration status. So although you may be non-resident on your immigration status, you could actually be resident for tax purposes. Because when it comes to resident versus non-resident for tax, it's all based on the number of days that you've actually spent in the US. So generally, most international students or scholars on F, J, M or Q visas are considered non-resident for tax purposes. But the rule that the IRS follow is that if you're an F1 or a J1 student, for example, you'll generally be considered non-resident for the first 5 calendar years here in the US. But after that 5-year period, the IRS will look at what's known as the substantial presence test. Now that can sound a bit like a crazy maths equation, but essentially the substantial presence test, it's looking back at your previous 3 years and it's looking at your days of presence to determine your residency status. So it'll look at all, excuse me, sorry, it'll look at all of your days of presence in the current year or the year you're filing for. So we'll say 2024 in this case. It'll take 1/3 of your days of presence in the year before that and 1/6 of your days of presence in the year before that. And if that totals to 183 days or more, then you would be deemed resident for tax purposes. Now, if you're considered resident for tax purposes, you need to submit a resident tax return. Sprintax wouldn't allow you to proceed any further than step 1, as you would need to use a resident provider. So we won't allow you to prepare an incorrect tax return. We'll point you in the right direction. But the good news is you don't need to worry about those calculations. Sprintax will work all of that out for you. So all you need to do is to enter your entry and exit dates and the required information in step 1 on Sprintax, and we will determine then if you're resident or non-resident. And there's no fee for that, so if you're unsure, go in, complete step 1, and we will work that out for you. Now, you'll have heard me mention a calendar year there. So if, for example, Neil enters the US on December 30th, 2024, but his semester at his university doesn't start until February 2025, the IRS will actually count 2024 as Neil's first year of presence in the US, even though he's only spent 2 days in the US in 2024. So just to be aware of that. Residency rules then, they change slightly for researchers or scholars on J visas. So if you're a researcher or scholar on a J visa, instead of that 5-year grace period where you're considered a non-resident, you actually only get 2 years. And after you've been in the US then for 2 years on that J Scholar Research visa, the IRS will then look at the substantial presence test. So this next slide then, it's just a quick residency summary. So it outlines the different visa types, the number of years each visa type is exempt from the substantial presence test, and if there's a FICA exemption available. So you'll see here, for example, the F1 and J1 student are exempt from the substantial presence test for 5 years and have that FICA exemption, whereas many of the other J1 categories then would fall under that 2-year rule. As I mentioned, we will be sharing the recording with everybody later, so if you want to look back over any of this in any more detail, you will certainly have access to do that. So next we're looking at who must file. So who needs to file a non-resident tax return for 2024? So really important to be aware that every non-resident who is an exempt individual must complete at least Form 8843, irrespective of income or days of presence. So that is the minimum filing requirement for all non-residents in the US. Now, previously there was a personal exemption where you could earn up to a certain amount before you would trigger a filing requirement. But with the changes to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act a couple of years back, the personal exemption has been abolished. So now anything you earn over $0 will trigger a filing requirement. So, if you earn any income at all, it's not only the Form 8843 you need to submit, you'll need to submit the federal return, the full federal return, which is the 1040 NR. So I suppose most important piece of information on this slide is that every non-resident who's an exempt individual must complete at least Form 8843. And if you've received any US income over $0, you will also trigger a full federal filing requirement. So everybody on today's session, if you were in the US at all during 2024 on an F, J, M or Q visa as an exempt individual, you need to do something when it comes to taxes. So what is Form 8843? Well, as I said, it is the minimum filing requirement for all non-residents in the US, and essentially it's a declaration of your non-resident status for the tax year. Now, it is a pretty straightforward document. It'll request your name, your address, the type of visa you're on, and the number of days you've spent in the US. And by giving that information, then you've completed your obligation for Form 8843 filing. But also important to note that Form 8843, it's also known as a statement for exempt individuals and individuals with a medical condition. So you could be thinking, well, what on earth is that? Well, if you think of it as a declaration of your non-resident status with the IRS to basically say, hey, my name is Elvira, I'm an F1 student. Because I'm still non-resident for tax purposes, I'm still an exempt individual, so please don't count my days of presence in the US towards that substantial presence test we spoke about earlier. Now, again, it is a pretty simple form. If it's a case you only need to submit Form 8843, You don't need to have a social security number or an ITIN if it's just Form 8843 you're submitting. And again, the good news here is that Sprintax will prepare this form for you. So you don't need to go filling it out yourself. The software will prepare that form for you as well. But again, it is the minimum filing requirement for all non-residents in the US. So next we're looking at the type of income that will trigger a filing requirement. So I mentioned a little while ago, if you receive any US income over $0, it will trigger a filing requirement. So what might that include? Well, obviously the first and most common would be employment income. So if you've had an employer, you've received wages or salary, obviously that's going to be considered income and will be reportable on your tax return. It is going to trigger a federal filing requirement. Also, if you receive a scholarship that covers costs other than tuition and tuition-related expenses, so let's say your scholarship covers room and board, or maybe a stipend or transport to and from school, your meals, anything like that, it is going to be considered income and will trigger a filing requirement. Maybe you've got investment income, or you've invested in cryptocurrencies, or some of the less common types of income maybe you've been to Vegas and you've won on the slot machines, or you've attended a focus group and you've received a gift card in payment for that. Or maybe you have a spare room in your apartment and you've rented that out on Airbnb for over 14 nights. All of this would be considered reportable. So your US income, anything over $0, is going to be reportable and trigger your federal filing requirement. So on the other hand, then, there are some incomes that don't trigger a filing requirement for non-residents. And the first is a scholarship for tuition and tuition-related expenses. So let's use an example of a sports scholarship here. If you're a student on a sports scholarship that covers your tuition, but also covers your room and board, maybe your transport to and from school, your living expenses and so on, areas that are outside of tuition, that is considered a taxable scholarship and is considered income. But if your scholarship covers just your tuition, then the IRS are not concerned with it and you don't need to report it on your tax return. The second point here then relates to scholarships received from outside the US. So if you receive a scholarship from your home country to travel to the US to study, the IRS won't tax this because although it may be taxed in your home country, it's not US source income. So they won't be interested in that and you don't need to claim it on your tax return. Points 3 and 4 then are similar in that although you may be taxed on them overseas, the IRS are not concerned with it when it comes to filing your non-resident tax return and you don't need to claim it. Similarly, if you've worked in your home country before you arrive in the US and you bring this money with you, again, the IRS are not concerned with it. It's not US source income and you don't need to report that on your tax return. And we've interest on regular savings accounts here, and important to point out that for most international students and scholars, if you have a regular Bank of America account, for example, then that's going to be tax exempt and the IRS won't be concerned with that. But if you have the likes of a Robinhood investment account that's accrued a lot of interest each year, in that case, the IRS may be concerned with that. And if you're making a gain from that investment account, there's a high chance that you will receive an income document for that account and you will need to claim it on your tax return. But for most standard accounts, you don't need to claim it. So next then, we're going to look at some of the income documents that you may receive. So the first is the W-2 document, and Form W-2 is probably the most common document that you could receive. It relates to wages, relates to salary or compensation, and it would include details of any income that you've earned and any tax that was withheld on that income. And also you could receive multiple W-2 documents if you've had multiple employers. So just to be aware of that. So if you worked for 2 different employers in 2024, you'd expect to receive a W-2 from each one. And typically, the deadline to receive your W-2 is January 31st, 2025 for the 2024 tax year. The second document then is the 1042S document. And this document applies mostly to taxable scholarships, stipends, any royalty payments, prizes, any tax treaty exempt income will typically be outlined on a 1042S document. So let's go back again to the sports scholarship I mentioned a little while ago. If your scholarship is covering anything outside of tuition or tuition-related expenses, then you will receive a 1042S for it. But if your scholarship is not taxable, you wouldn't expect to receive this income document. And the deadline to receive your 1042S document is March 15th, 2025, again for the 2024 tax year. And the final document then is the 1099 series document, and that covers everything that's considered miscellaneous income. So what might that be? Well, maybe it's rental income from a property that you've had on Airbnb. And in such case, if you've received income from Airbnb, then they will issue you with a 1099 series document. Also, if you had an investment account and you've made a gain on that, there's a high chance that your broker or the person you've made your investments with will issue you with the 1099 document. Also, commissions are under the 1099 umbrella, but the most common one would be independent contractor services. So typically, if you're working independently and not as an employee of a business, but as a contractor, you will receive a 1099 at the end of the filing year. And also you may receive a 1099 INT from your bank, if you've received interest on that, and that's something that you would include in your tax return as well. So important to be aware that not everybody will receive all of these income documents. You'll only receive the ones relevant to you. So it's not a case that you should all receive a W-2, a 1042S, a 1099. You'll only get the ones that are relevant to you. So if your only source of income was employment income, you'd receive a W-2. If you received a taxable scholarship, you might receive that 1042S document. There may be some of you that will receive a W-2 and a 1042S, and maybe even a 1099. But just to be aware that it's not a case that you will receive all of these, you'll only receive the ones relevant to the income that you've received. But also important to be aware that you do need to wait until you've received all of your income documents before you sit down to prepare your taxes. So if you're expecting a W-2 and a 1042S document, wait until you've got both of them before you sit down to prepare your taxes. So if you go ahead and you do it once you receive your W-2 and you're not including details from the 1042S because you haven't received that yet, what you need to do then when you get that 1042S is you need to sit down and prepare an amended tax return to include the details from that 1042S as well. So wait until you've received all income documents that you're expecting before you sit down to prepare your taxes. So the next thing we'll look at then is your spouse and dependents and how they should be treated when it comes to tax. So the IRS, they are pretty strict on how your spouse and dependents should be treated. If they've never worked at all and they've received no income, they still need to complete that form 8843, similar to you. That's if they've spent time in the US during that tax year. But if they've had any income, then they will trigger a federal filing requirement. And if they're in a state where there's state tax, they may also trigger a state filing requirement. So they basically have the same rules as you. But also important to note that non-residents can't file a joint return with their spouse. They must be filed separately. However, if you're a non-resident and you're married to a resident, you can elect to file jointly on your spouse's resident tax return, but we would recommend that you do the math on both options first to see which option would be more beneficial to your tax position. So next up we have FICA taxes, and what is it? Well, if you're in the US at the age of 65 and you need assistance paying your medical bills, FICA tax would assist you with that. But the thinking is, as a non-resident international student or scholar, the chances are you're probably not going to be in the US at the age of 65, and for that reason, there's a general rule that if you're on an F1 or a J1 visa, you're exempt from paying FICA taxes. But, in some cases, if you're working off campus maybe and your employer isn't aware of this, they may treat you the same as they would a resident who does pay FICA taxes. So what we'd say here is check your W-2. There will be a section on there that says FICA or Social Security or Medicare. And if tax has been withheld and if you're a non-resident on an F1 or a J1 visa, then you should firstly ask your employer for a refund. But if they're not willing to issue that refund, then definitely submit a FICA return or FICA application via form 843 or 8316 because you will get all of that back. So here we've just provided a breakdown of the impact that FICA taxes can have on your wages when withheld incorrectly. So if FICA taxes are withheld in error, you could actually have a significant amount of money coming out of your paycheck that didn't need to be withheld. So for example, you'll see here, the non-resident earning $20,000 would have $1,530 of FICA withheld from their wages, whereas the non-resident student earning $50,000 would have $3,825 of FICA withheld, and this is the student portion only. So if you have had FICA withheld incorrectly, the first approach, as I said, is to ask your employer for a refund. It's the quickest way to get it back, but it can be tricky, of course. If the employer refuses to give the FICA refund, then definitely apply for that refund using Form 843 and 8316 with the IRS. But I suppose ensuring that your employer is aware of your tax position and when you should or shouldn't be paying FICA, it'll save you having taxes withheld from your wages in error, and it'll save you the hassle of claiming that refund back later on. So up until this point, we've chatted about how everyone on this session, if you were present in the US for any time at all in 2024 on an F, J, M or Q visa as an exempt individual, will need to do something when it comes to taxes, minimum being Form 8843, but if you've received any income, any US source income over $0, you will trigger a federal filing requirement. Well, you may also trigger a state filing requirement. And state tax rules differ from state to state, where some states will say that you only need to file if you earn over $8,000, for example. Some will say over $17,000. Others will say that you need to file from the very first dollar. And of course, we know there are some states where there's no state tax. But it can also depend on things like your visa type, the number of days you've spent in the state, and even down to the type of accommodation you've lived in. So it can be quite complicated in terms of state taxes. But again, the good news is that Sprintax will work all of this out for you. Once you provide the information we require in the Sprintax questionnaire, we'll do the calculations. We'll check to see if you're resident or non-resident. We'll check your filing requirements, if it's Form 8843, if it's the 1040 NR, if you've triggered a state tax return. And it's possible that you may trigger more than one state tax return if you've lived or worked in more than one state, but we will work all of that out for you. So next up we have ITIN, and I know this can definitely be a bit of a trouble area, and it definitely causes some headache and heartache for you as international students and scholars, but also for your school or institution. But for anyone who may be unfamiliar, ITIN stands for Individual Taxpayer Identification Number, and it's generally required by individuals who've received taxable income and they need to file a federal tax return, but they're not eligible for a social security number. So it can be pretty common and most common among scholarship recipients such as athletes. But in terms of the application process, the application form is the W7 and it can be applied for in advance of filing your federal tax return or alongside your federal tax return. But the process does change depending on which route you're going to go down. So in terms of applying for an ITIN in advance of filing your federal tax return, a responsible officer at your school can certify copies of the required documents. But where the process changes then is where you're applying for an ITIN alongside your federal tax return. At this stage, the responsible officer at your school can no longer certify the documents unless they're a certified acceptance agent. So in this case, when you're applying for your ITIN alongside your tax return, you'd need to have your documents certified by a CAA, a certified acceptance agent, or at a local IRS office, or at the governmental department that issued your identification document, or at a US embassy or consulate. So I suppose those are the different ways of applying for an ITIN. But also important to note that if you have a social security number, you don't need an ITIN. So this will only be needed by somebody who has triggered a filing requirement but doesn't have a social security number. And as I mentioned, probably most common among scholarship recipients such as athletes. So next then we have Form 1098T, and this is a really important slide because it is the #1 form of misfiling every year for non-residents. So Form 1098T applies only to residents, and it's an educational tax credit. So if you were to use a website that prepares taxes for residents and you say you've received 1098T, you could actually get a tax credit that you're not entitled to. You know, as a non-resident, you're not entitled to receive this tax credit. And if the IRS realise that you've claimed this tax credit, not only will they look for any refund back, but they could also apply fees and penalties. So just be really careful on that. But I suppose important to note that sometimes all students with a social security number on file with their school will get one, even non-residents. So it can cause a bit of confusion. So just a reminder, 1098T, it's not relevant to non-residents for tax purposes. If you've received it and you're non-resident, just put it away somewhere safe for your own records. You're not going to need it when it comes to filing your non-resident tax return. And Sprintax will not ask for details from this form. So if you're on a website preparing your tax return as a non-resident and you're being asked for details from Form 1098T, you're in the wrong place. You're on a resident tax preparation provider. So just to be aware of that. 1098T is only applicable to residents. If you receive it as a non-resident, just put it away somewhere safe. You're not going to need it when it comes to filing your tax return. So next we're looking at timelines for a refund and how long will it take for my refund to come through. So for a federal refund, the IRS advised that it generally takes between 6 weeks and 6 months for your refund to come through. Now we typically see that it normally comes through within that 6-week period, but they do advise that it can take up to 6 months, so you do need to be aware of that. Now you can check the status of your refund if you visit irs.gov/refunds. You'll be able to check the status of your refund there. If you're due a state refund, timelines are kind of similar, but of course it can vary from state to state. Some states may be more backlogged than others. But if you need to check the status of a state return, do allow that time frame firstly, allow at least that 6-week period for it to come through. If you haven't received anything by then and you want to follow up, you'd need to reach out to the State Department directly. So next we're looking at implications of misfiling. So there may be some of you on today's session and you're thinking, okay, I've been in the US for the last number of years and I didn't do anything at all, or else I filed last year, but I filed as a resident and filed incorrectly. Well, the first thing we'll always say is don't panic, but do set the record straight. So if you've never filed at all, we'd say definitely catch up. And the good news is that if you're due a refund in the last 3 years, the IRS are happy to issue that to you. So there could be money sitting there with the IRS waiting for you to collect. But on the other side, if you owe them money, there's no cut-off point. They will expect you to go back as far as necessary if it's a case that you owe them. If you've misfiled, so if you filed as a resident in the past, maybe you've used the likes of TurboTax to prepare a resident tax return when you should have been filing a non-resident return, what you need to do now is to submit an amended tax return, which is the 1040X, along with a correct non-resident tax return. So definitely important that your tax record is correct and up to date for each year that you've been in the US. So, if you haven't filed for a year that you've been here, even if it is just Form 8843, or if you filed as a resident in the past when it should have been a non-resident return, we would recommend, setting the record straight, catching up on any returns you've missed, or correcting any returns that you filed incorrectly. And Sprintax can assist with both. So if you do need assistance with any of these, please reach out. We'd be happy to help. But what are the actual implications then of not filing or misfiling even? So the first one here is that non-residents are required to comply with all US laws, including IRS and filing tax forms, even if it is just that Form 8843. But I suppose the one we've highlighted here and the one we'll always continue to emphasize is the impact that it could have on your future immigration status. So there may be some of you on today's session that would like to stay in the US, maybe apply for a change of status in future, for example. And it is very likely that you will be asked for evidence of tax compliance in your visa interview. So we'd hate to see tax being something that would stop you from staying in the US. So with that said, it is so important that your tax record is correct and up to date for every year that you've been in the US. Also, if you're late filing or you haven't filed and you owe tax to the IRS, they will apply fees and penalties and interest can accrue on that. But finally, you might be missing out on a refund, and this is the only way that you can claim that back. So I suppose firstly, you are required to comply with all US laws. It's part of your visa conditions. It could affect your future immigration status, but you may also be due a refund, and this is the only way that you can get that back. And then finally, before I hand over to Neil to bring us through an overview of using Sprintax and what that looks like, just one quick slide on being careful about options being recommended to you. So, you may have a friend who's used TurboTax to prepare their tax returns, and that's absolutely fine if they are resident for tax purposes. But if they're non-resident, you can't use TurboTax to prepare your tax returns. And you'll see here, we've taken a little snippet from the TurboTax help page where they're asked, does TurboTax handle Form 1040 NR for non-resident aliens? And TurboTax themselves are saying, although TurboTax don't support IRS Form 1040 NR, we have partnered with Sprintax to offer both federal and state tax preparation. So they're telling you here themselves that they don't support Form 1040 NR and they would send you to Sprintax. So just to be careful, be sure that you are submitting a correct non-resident tax return if you're a non-resident. And we've helped over 12,000 non-residents to amend their tax returns over the last number of years. So, just to keep that in mind, be careful about the options being recommended to you. So that brings us on into the final section before we look at questions. And this is the part where Neil is going to bring us through an overview of using the Sprintax software and what it looks like when you sit down to prepare those returns.
Great, thank you very much, Elvira.
No
So
worries.
the very first step in using Sprintax is to have a look at the email that you would have received from your institution. And within that email, all of the instructions that you need to get started will be there. It'll say stuff like register and follow the link that's within the email. It'll give you information on how to receive the discount, which we'll talk about on the final screen. But it is very important that you do go ahead and read this email in full. And when you're ready to move forward, you can then click on the link within the email. Once you click on that link, it'll bring you to the Sprintax login page. Now on this login page, you can either log in with your credentials that you've used in previous years, or if you're new to Sprintax, you can register an account. And to register an account, you'll need your first name, your last name, your email address, and then also your phone number. And after you've registered your account, you can then move on to the first step. So here we are, this is the residency determination section. So within this section, we're going to first ask you some basic yes or no questions, and they're fairly straightforward. So are you a US citizen? Have you applied for a green card? Have you applied for US citizenship or lawful residence? And once you've said yes or no to those questions, we'll then ask you, when was your first visit to the US? So this isn't just on your current immigration status. What we're asking here is for your first visit ever. So back to Elvira's point a while ago, where you could have been very young and over here on vacation. That's actually the date that you need to give within this section. After that, then we'll ask you to enter your entry and exit dates since you first started coming to the US. So since that date that you just provided to us. And you can enter all of your entry and exit dates. And based on that, we'll then know if you're a resident or a non-resident for tax purposes. Now, if we do find that you're a resident for tax purposes, we will stop the process here. A pop-up box will appear and we'll advise you that you're a resident, and for that reason, we recommend you use TurboTax. Because Sprintax is only for non-residents, you won't be able to use the Sprintax software if you're a resident. Now, generally on these sessions, we get a ton of questions asking us, am I a resident or non-resident for tax purposes? We're generally not able to answer that because there's a ton of information that we need. But to get that answer, you just complete this step here and you'll know yourself if you're a resident or a non-resident. So on to the next section then, which is the income details section. So just prior to this screen, we're going to ask you what income documents you received, if any. So if you received a W-2 and maybe a 1042S, you can choose those forms from the drop-down menu. You can choose the quantity. So if you receive 2 W-2s, you can say 2. If you receive one 1042S, you can say 1. Or if you receive no forms, you can say that, and it'll skip this this income documents section. But once you click onto the next page, it's going to give you a blank template of each of the forms that you received. So if you told us that you received 2 W-2 forms, you can fill in the first W-2 form within the section here. And once you click next, you'll see the identical page show up, and that's when you put in your second form. Now you can use our OCR, or optical character recognition technology here. It basically means you'll upload a PDF or a very good photo of your income document, and the software will identify what fields should be matched to the actual software fields. If for some reason that doesn't work, in some cases it doesn't, maybe the photo isn't good enough, or else the software isn't able to identify all of the fields, you can just go down, you can have a look at the template, you can have a look at your income document, and you can copy it in word for word and match it exactly. And you can click next then when you're ready. Now, it's just worth noting, on every page of the Sprintax software, you will see a chatbot feature and our customer service feature. So if you do have any questions as you go through the questionnaire, feel free to reach out to our team via this option here. Now, just a heads up, we are going to try to answer your question via our chatbot first. We find that in, I think it's 75% of cases, we can actually answer your question without you needing to talk to one of our agents. But if we cannot, you'll then be connected directly to our customer service team, and they'll be able to help you, and that'll be a live person. So the next step then is state taxes. So here we're going to ask you what states you lived in for the 2024 tax year. And if you entered or exit those states, you can enter it all here. Just remember, in the first section where you entered your entry and exit dates for the federal taxes, if you are out of the country for any reason, that will need to match your dates here, because sometimes it will show an error if your dates don't match exactly. So just be aware of that. If we find that you do have a state filing requirement, we'll then show you what states you have a filing requirement for, and you can click that box if you want Sprintax to prepare the return for you. Just a note, some students may have multiple state filing requirements if you did live in multiple states throughout the year. So on to the next section then, which is the order breakdown section. So if you have a federal return, you'll see the cost of a federal return. If you have a state return, you'll see the cost of the state return. And here is where you have your access code field. So within that email, if you received a code, you can enter the code here. If the discount was being provided to you in a different way, you can also enter that here. But just be aware, this is where you would get access to that discount. And once you click on validate, it should remove the cost, depending on what the discount provides. So after that, then the software will have a look at all the information that you provided, and it will determine if you are eligible to e-file your federal return. If you are eligible to e-file your federal return, we'll give you the option to say, I confirm I did not file my federal return before, and then you can say proceed with e-file. Just a note, not everybody is eligible to e-file their federal return. The IRS have a specific list and a specific group of people that are eligible. So if you do not see this screen, it means that unfortunately you don't fall into those parameters. If you want more information on who is eligible and who is not, you can have a look at the Sprintax blog that we've linked here, and we'll basically go through why someone will be eligible versus not. You can also go ahead and you can download your forms underneath this section. You can click view, you can click download, and that's the case for both the federal and the state. Now, we mentioned that some people may be eligible to e-file their federal return. Just note that you will always need to physically mail your state return. And if you're not eligible to e-file your federal return, you will also need to physically mail your federal return. So please, have a look at the instructions. You'll see that once you download your tax pack, we'll give you information that says if you're due a refund or if you owe the IRS money, We'll summarize your overall income, and then we'll give you very, very clear instructions on where to send these forms. And we're going to say, print off this tax pack, keep one part for you, keep the other part for the IRS, sign on these specific pages. You will need to attach your income documents to the tax pack you're mailing to the IRS or the state office. And then you'll need to put it in an envelope and send it to the address that we provide to you. And all of that is covered within the first page or two on your Sprintax tax pack. Every year we get foreign nationals reaching out saying, I didn't receive my refund and I was due one. And when we look into the case, we can see that they did everything they needed to do on Sprintax. They generated their tax pack, but actually they never mailed it to the IRS. So that is a hugely important step. If you don't mail this document to the IRS, they're not going to receive it. Obviously, if you're e-filing your federal return, just a reminder, you do not need to mail it also. So just to finish up then on other supports that Sprintax does have available for you. So first off, we've put a lot of time into our YouTube channel, and we have a ton of educational tax videos there. So have a look online. If there is a question that generally comes up via our live chat team, we've generally tended to make a video on it. Our blog then, so anything that's a bit more complicated, we've tried to release a blog article on it. Anything that's quite topical around non-resident tax, we've also released a blog article on it. So again, it's worthwhile having a look at that. Some of the times it's best to just Google it and say Sprintax blog and then some keywords that you're looking for. And that should bring you directly into the article that you're looking for on the blog. We do have 24/7 live chat. So if you do need any assistance as you go through the Sprintax process, our live chat team is there to assist you. And obviously you're on one of our tax workshops and webinars, but this recording will be made available afterwards. So it's normally sent about 2 to 3 hours after the session has ended. You'll get an automatic email with the link to it. So if you do need to look back on any points we mentioned today, you can use that link to do so. But that's it. That's really everything we wanted to cover today. They're the basics of non-resident tax. And if you know everything we covered here, it'll make the process a lot easier for you. So I can see now there's questions coming in as we present. So we'd be happy to have a look and answer some of your questions. Great. So just looking in the chat here, and I just want to just clarify something I said earlier. For the Colombia discount, which covers the federal and Form 8843, the only way to get that discount is by going to the Colombia website. And Scott from the Colombia ISSO has posted that link in the chat. We're going to post it one more time just so there's no confusion. But this is the link that, let me just post it here. This is the link that you should use to receive the discount. So have a read of that page. We always recommend you have a read of that page in full before you go to Sprintax. We recommend that you're comfortable with everything there, and within that page you'll be asked to log in to your Colombia login page, and then that will bring you to Sprintax. And by doing that, it'll authenticate the code. So instead of putting it in at checkout, this will automatically apply it. So please just make sure that you're using that. If you don't use that link, unfortunately, you will not get the federal and Form 8843 discount. You will need to use the link in order to get that discount, and unfortunately, there's no real other way around it. So just be careful of that. It's an important step. Just some other things then. So obviously, there's going to be a ton of questions that come in. As I mentioned, we do have a ton of support, and there is about 250,000 non-residents that use Sprintax every year that can get through Sprintax without needing assistance. So we'd recommend that you try to answer all the questions as best you can. Ensure you have all your income documents. And then as you're going through the questionnaire, if you do have any questions about a certain question we're asking, you can go ahead and you can reach out to our live chat team. Excuse me. Other stuff then, there was a couple of questions on New York State and state taxes in general. We do We do assist with state taxes. It's the same questionnaire. So once you go through the online questionnaire, we'll then be able to prepare the correct state tax for you, if applicable. Obviously, not everybody will have a state tax return, but if you do, we will be able to do it. So let me see what else is trending. 1098T has come up quite a bit. As a non-resident, Form 1098T is not applicable to you. So you know, even if you do receive it, you can put it away for your own records, but Sprintax isn't going to ask you about Form 1098T. There's also a lot of questions from students who are asking how they'll access their account once they finish with Columbia eventually. You can use your personal email address on your Sprintax account. So it is a personal tax return. So, you know, Columbia won't have access to your personal tax return. So that means you decide, you know, the email you use and the password that you set. And then you can reset that password, obviously, if you're using your personal email address. So that shouldn't be a problem. There was also some questions around insurance forms. So generally for insurance, there's 3 different forms. There's Form 1095A, 1095B, and 1095C. Form 1095A is applicable to your tax return if you have received it. It's very rare a non-resident will receive it, but if you do, you can use that on your tax return. And much more commonly then, Form 1095B, which has come up a lot in the chat, and Form 1095C. These forms are not applicable to your non-resident tax return. So if you receive Form 1095B or C, you can put them away for your own records, but Sprintax isn't going to ask you any questions on them.
Perfect. And I can jump in there with a few, Neil, if you like.
Okay.
So first one here, if we have no income, are we still required to file taxes? So yeah, if you were present in the US during the tax year, even if you didn't receive any income, you still need to submit Form 8843. That's the minimum filing requirement for all non-residents in the US. If you've received any income, then any US income over $0, you will trigger the federal filing requirement. Lots of questions about entry and exit dates and so on. So I've been in the US for more than 183 days over the past 2 years. Do I qualify as resident for tax purposes? Those kind of questions, they're very hard to answer on a session like this without knowing the details of your entry and exits in and out of the US. So what we'd say there is go in and complete step 1 on Sprintax and we will work that out for you. So if you're unsure at all, just fill in your details there. We'll do the calculations. We'll let you know then if you've been in the US long enough to be considered resident, we'll let you know and we'll point you in the right direction. But if you're still considered non-resident, you'll proceed on through the next steps then with Sprintax. Another question on visits, people asking, you know, I don't remember the exact visits and the dates and so on. Now you can, I suppose, go back through your old passports firstly. You might find some information there. You can use the i94.gov website. I think that has recent travel history. I think it goes back something like 10 years. So i94.gov will give you a lot of your history there. Prior to that, your old passports, maybe check with family members, see do they have information of your visits. Worst case scenario, if you don't have the exact dates, but you know maybe you spent a certain time period in the US in a certain year, put in some dates that account for the number of days you've spent. If the dates aren't exact, that's okay, but do, to the best of your ability, account for the number of dates that you've spent in the United States.
Great, thanks, Elvira.
No worries.
So just to confirm, the Columbia University link will provide you with a discount on the federal and Form 8843. And if you do need a state return, you'll cover that cost yourself, and you can cover that cost at checkout. I also saw there were some questions about those that may owe the IRS money and how that works. If you owe the IRS money, Sprintax will ask you how you wish to pay that. It can either be via a debit or credit card, or else an ACH payment or check. Depending on what you choose, we'll then give you instructions on how you can pay that bill to the IRS. So again, that's all covered under the software. Also, lots of questions on tax treaties and whether Sprintax provides tax treaties. We definitely do. So once you go through the software, Sprintax will identify if any applicable tax treaties are there. And if they are, we'll give you the information on it, and we'll ask you if you'd like to apply it or not. So all of the possible tax treaties that could apply to you will apply in Sprintax. And just a note on that, tax treaties are very specific to certain areas. So it could be the income that you received. It could be the home country that you're from. It could be the amount of time you expect to spend in the US. So if your friend is from the same home country and they're receiving a tax treaty but you're not, and you're wondering why, it might be because you're receiving wages or salary income and they're receiving a scholarship. So it can change quite a lot. But rest assured, Sprintax will make that determination for you. Some other stuff then. I received the 1042S for my internship from my employer. Should I receive the W-2? So if it was wages or salary, generally you'll receive a W-2. But if that was covered under a tax treaty, you may receive a W-2 and a 1042S, because the 1042S will always cover your tax treaty exempt income. So I'd recommend reaching out to whoever issued you with the 1042S just to confirm if this is the only document that you'll receive.
Great, and I can jump in again, Neil. Should I fill forms in Sprintax to determine my resident or non-resident status? So all you need to do is just fill in your details in step 1. We'll ask for details of your entry and exit dates and so on. So fill in that information there and we'll determine your residency status. We'll prepare then any relevant forms for you if you are non-resident for taxes. What is the cost for filing the state return, since you said that's not covered? So a state return, the fee there is $44.95 if you've triggered that. There's questions then on ITIN. You know, if I have a social security number, I won't need an ITIN. That's absolutely right. If you have a social security number, you will not need an ITIN. ITIN would only be needed by somebody who has maybe received a scholarship, say, that covers costs outside of tuition, has triggered the filing requirement, but doesn't have a social security number. In that case, you'd need to have an ITIN. But if you have a social security number, you will not need an ITIN. Or if it's a case that you only need to submit form 8843, in that case, you don't need to have a social security number or an ITIN. You can submit form 8843 without that.
Great. So you covered the state tax fee, so that was the next one I was going to cover, so that's good. Can I use Sprintax to file taxes before 2024? Yeah, absolutely. You can use Sprintax to back tax. Just go on, choose the year you wish to file a tax return for, and fill it out as if you were doing it back then. Now, if you do have a social security number now, and maybe you didn't last year or the year before, you can use your current social security number, even if you didn't have it last year. So that works fine. There's a question here relating to form 8823 and whether Sprintax, whether that needs to be included in Sprintax. Form 8823 is a form that provides your payroll office or your employer with information on any applicable tax treaties. So Sprintax isn't going to ask you for that because it's not needed for your tax return. Now, just so it doesn't get confusing, form 8823 is different to form 8843. So just be aware, form 8843 is the form that everybody will need to complete as a non-resident and send to the IRS now. And the other form that I mentioned is for tax treaties, but it's done at the start of the year and is provided to your payroll office versus to the IRS.
I suppose just one more question on my side, Neil, before we finish up. People asking about catching up on previous years and can they do that on Sprintax? Absolutely. You can go in, you just choose the year that you need to file, answer the questions based on that year. We'll generate the relevant forms for that year, and you need to do that then for each year that you need to catch up on. Also, say for anybody that needs to correct a return that they've submitted incorrectly, you just go in, you choose the year you want to amend, and then underneath there's a little radio button where you can tick to say, I need to amend a tax return that I've already submitted to the IRS. And we'll guide you through the amended tax return process then and generate those forms for you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Elvira. So maybe just one note then from my side before we finish up. I guess there's a couple of questions coming in on the income document. So I just want to summarize that before we finish. Just note that if you receive taxable income throughout the year, the chances are you'll receive a W-2 for wages or salary. maybe a form 1042S for a taxable scholarship, or if a tax treaty applied, or one of the 1099 forms, maybe for from your bank. So 1099 INT is popular. All of these forms will be entered into Sprintax, and they'll be entered under the income documents section. And then once you fill out the questionnaire on Sprintax and have added your income forms, we'll then prepare the forms that you send to the IRS. And those forms will be 8843. But for anyone that has received taxable income, it'll be form 1040 NR. So just to summarize that, and obviously if you receive no income, you won't receive, a W-2 or a 1042S or a 1099. But that's it. I know we got through a lot of questions throughout the session, so hopefully everything is answered. I can see there's a couple of questions repeating themselves, so we won't get to them today. But we do appreciate everybody joining today. We hope you found it beneficial and made things a little clearer. But other than that, the very best of luck with your 2024 tax return.
Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.